In this lecture, we're looking at John Wesley and the rise of the Methodist movement within the new evangelicalism of the 18th century. John Wesley is a man that is both widely known and yet often misunderstood. It's not that we don't know much about him, it's that at times, those who claim his name as part of their theological or denominational heritage, or even those from without who might have trouble with some of his doctrines, don't spend enough time understanding the context, the way he flows out of the 17th century into the 18th century, and the ways that the theological ideas of dissent coming from the reign of Charles II and beyond really shapes Wesley's understanding of the Christian life and of salvation. John Wesley, though, and his brother Charles, as well as George Whitefield, are three of the most important men to really shape the Christian voice and the grammar during the entirety of the 18th century. And given that this is the revolutionary era and that there are so many decisions being made, both culturally, politically, and socially, particularly in the New World, with things like slavery becoming ingrained as part of the American identity, as well as the democratization, as we call it, of the Christian life, the breakdown of the old established ways of being a confessional church from Europe as it moves into the New World, as there is this melting pot not only of ethnicities and languages, but also the melting pot of different denominational trends, and given the Wesleyan and Whitefieldian understanding of revival, really shapes the context of what would become American evangelicalism. The Wesleys and Whitefield, I always say, were really the first British invasion. Not so much like the Beatles, but here in this case more like the invasion of a new British, robust understanding of the Christian life and of the need for revival and revivalistic preaching. Though we are used to discussing non-denominational movements and the charismatic movements and all these things from the 20th century, you really have to understand that the Methodist movement shaped so much of the early days of both colonial America and the post-revolutionary era of what it meant to be doing church here in North America. So to begin with, we're going to look in this lecture at who John Wesley was, what was his rise to become a preacher and a revivalist and an organizer of the Methodist Church. And then in our next lecture, we're going to look at more of John Wesley's theology, and we're going to contrast that with the theology of George Whitefield. But for now, we look at the man, John Wesley. Wesley was born in 1703, just as the 18th century was dawning, in the city of Epworth. He was the 15th of 19 children to Samuel and Susanna Wesley. Now, no, it's not the case that they had 19 little ones running around. Unfortunately, the tragic circumstances of so much of child rearing during this day meant that only 9 lived beyond infancy. Still, though, 19 children, 9 of whom live, is a pretty staggeringly high number. This is part of the ethos of this day. This is a day before birth control, but also this is a day when so many infants died that it was not uncommon to have a significantly large number of children, at least by the standards of the modern world. Samuel and Susanna are a real powerful combination as parents for young John and Charles. Samuel himself was a pastor there in the city of Epworth, and he was a well-educated man. He had studied at Oxford. Susanna, though, gets the lion's share of the attention. I always say Susanna is one of the great 3 mothers of the church, known not so much for what she herself writes or says or does, but for the way that she nurtures her children. The 3 mothers, by the way, in my estimation, are Constantine's mom, Helena, Augustine's mom, Monica, who almost literally chases down Augustine for the faith, and here with Susanna. Susanna was the daughter of a dissenting pastor. Now, by this point, we've carried ourselves through a lot of that material. We've noticed how from Charles I on down to Charles II, after the Restoration, you have arise this group, this more or less Anabaptist-inspired, or at least the impulses within Anabaptism are renewed here. This group, called the dissenting group, a wide variety of all different kinds of stripes, theologically and culturally, who took issue with the established church. So right then and there, you can see that Susanna is not someone to be trifled with, let's just say, in terms of her faith. She takes it seriously. Both Samuel and Susanna raised their children in a very, very strict household. all kinds of rules and regulations, things that were, again, somewhat common in this day and age. But Susanna's application of these rules were pretty significant. Some find them to be a bit harsh, but this is a different century, and in this day and age, it was not considered to be too harsh. The children were well educated. It was assumed that they would be tutored by their parents in both Greek and Latin. Susanna kept charge of their spiritual life. As often as once a day, she would sit down for a little bit of time with each of her children to assess how they had been that day and to discuss the things of God. Not a whole lot is known about John's early years. There is one more or less apocryphal story. It's a true story, but the implication of it is certainly apocryphal. And that is, in 1709, at the age of 5, some embers fell upon the roof, and the entire house went up in flames. All of the family and the kids, except for John, made it out of the house. But by the time they noticed that little John Wesley was there on the second floor in a window, the staircase to reach him was itself up in flames, and the house was really in danger of burning down on top of him. Some neighbors, one man sitting on the shoulders of another, managed to grab him out of the second-story window, saving his life. And John really does see this, and he actually creates some of the mythology here as part and parcel to the serious call God had upon him. He describes himself as the, quote, brand plucked from the fire. And as the later years wore on and as his ministry grew, he always looked back to moments like this, but this one in particular, as examples of God's unfolding of his plan that he would lead a reformation and a revival for the church, not only in England, but in the New World. John went on to Christ Church, Oxford in 1720, one of the preeminent colleges there in the city of Oxford. He was a really precocious student. He graduated with his BA and his MA, and eventually he becomes a lecturer there and a fellow, teaching Greek and the New Testament. One of the real turning points for him personally was it was during this time that he began to read all kinds of things on the Christian life and on the application of God's law to himself for the sake of holiness. Now, it's important to note here, dissenting churches, Anabaptist churches, and a number of churches and theological traditions now in the English context are not going to have this Lutheran allergy to discussion of the law, of holiness, and the Christian life. Wesley is often credited with inspiring and starting holiness movements, as they would eventually be called. Wesley himself, as we'll see in our next lecture, talked about something called Christian perfection. And even in the context of what he calls his conversion, there is this belief that the Christian life is not really begun until you have conquered sin. Now, he is at times a bit ambiguous here. Does he mean pure perfection, or does he mean something like Christian victory over gross sin, where we see sanctification worked out? The complexity of the problem that was so ironclad for Luther between justification on the one hand and sanctification on the other. As we said in our lecture on Luther, he put these two as far as east is from west. As John is studying in Oxford, though, he's reading a number of texts and subjects on the Christian life, and he really begins to nuance his understanding of how God's law ought to be applied to his life. After some time in Oxford, though, he is called to be a pastor in a neighboring village with his father. So he goes back to the area of Epworth, and he is a pastor for 2 years. Only at the end of that is he called back to Oxford at the urging and prompting of one of his connections there to return to join up and take a junior fellowship so that he would not lose his lectureship at Oxford. It's during the second stint at Oxford, again as a junior fellow, that the origins of the Methodist movement really get underway. Charles Wesley had moved to Oxford by this point. He was a younger brother, and he had taken up his studies. While he was there, though, Charles and a couple of others began to, you might say, have a small group together, or an accountability group together. They met in the morning and they would pray and do all kinds of things together, almost always focusing on the Christian life and sanctification. When he arrives there again himself, John really takes the reins of this, and this movement, what would eventually be called the Holy Club, takes on a new serious tone. On most days, they met from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. to pray, read the Psalms, and do a number of different spiritual devotional practices. It's almost, you might say, like they're living a monastic life. Wednesday and Friday, they fast. There are honest vows taken that they will ideally not marry and will commit themselves radically to the gospel. They also began to do social work. This is one of the more underappreciated things about Wesley. They started going to prisons and doing prison ministry. They really reached out to the least in their midst. Over time, though, they began to attract, you might say, the wrong kind of attention. It's not that people were necessarily opposed to sanctification in the context of Oxford. Rather, you might say that people were relatively unconvinced that this was even good at all. This is, again, the 18th century. This is when you're starting to see a malaise and a lack of conviction about being really serious about your Christian life. However, for those who are Christian, overtly Christian there in Oxford, they start to use words that should be very familiar to us if we know our 16th and 17th century history. They begin to be called things like the enthusiasts, which is a code word. An enthusiast is exactly the word that Luther used to describe those who were Reformed. Now, in the context of Luther's day, he's referring to the sacraments. By this point, though, in the 18th century, an enthusiast was more of one of these dissenting radicals. And so the Holy Club and the Wesley brothers and a couple of others are being mocked and scorned for not towing the line of traditional religion. They're too serious about their faith. They gained some attention as well because one in their midst died prematurely and quite suddenly. And people began to blame the fact that he had fasted and done all these more excessive things, at least according to the standards of Oxford in this day, and that might have hastened his death. Now, there is no evidence of this. Wesley himself points out that the man had stopped fasting for a year and a half before his death. There's no way that had caused anything. But it's that attention, though, from the death of one of their members, where the name Methodist comes from. There was a pamphlet that described these, quote, Oxford Methodists. And in a letter around this time, Wesley actually refers to the name Methodist, you might say, as a badge of honor. They were being called the Methodists in something of a play on words, that these were men who thought that they could, through a certain method, through a certain devotional practice, affect their own sanctification. Wesley takes it as a badge of honor. He's saying, fine, call us the Methodists. We are people who care about the method of sanctification and about the progress and the process of the Christian life. As this spiritual experience deepens, Wesley ends up taking up a missionary activity to the New World. Again, he seems to be driven by his faith to want to go and do good works in a more, we might say, radical way. What was happening about this same time is there's a very important member of Parliament by the name of Oglethorpe. And Oglethorpe, like Wesley, was really committed to the least of those in their midst. Oglethorpe's passion was for the cessation of what was known in this day as debtor's prison. Those who got into debt, depending on how much, could be thrown into prison. And until the debts were paid back, you often would stay in that prison. Now, obviously, you can see the problem right here. If you are in prison, how in the world are you going to pay back your debts? In a manner of speaking, it was essentially a death knell to someone's life or their career. Well, Oglethorpe really lobbies hard against this excessive penalization of falling into debt. A number of debtors' prisons are shut down. However, the problem is you're spilling all of these prisoners out onto the streets, now with no money, still in debt, technically speaking, and often they were unhireable. Well, Oglethorpe actually puts a proposal before Parliament in which some southern lands in the New World will be established as a new colony to rehabilitate those who had fallen into debt and who needed, just simply from an economic standpoint, a new way of life. And so in 1732, the state of Georgia is founded through the action of Oglethorpe in order to provide a place for people to come and start over. Well, the city of Savannah, as it would eventually be called, was one of the first places where they landed. Wesley decides that he is going to join up with this group. He is going to go and minister to those who are moving to the New World to start over, and he hoped he was going to do missionary work amongst Native Americans. Now, again, it needs to be noted, not everyone who moves to Georgia during this time is themselves a debtor in the worst possible sense. Rather, this is a haven for them. Others came for economic reasons, etc. But the central purpose of it was to be a place, again, to start over. And it speaks to Wesley's passion here. He wants to go to where those who have, in part, just come out of prison, or maybe those who are starting over. All kinds of reasons that people are moving to this new area of Georgia. But Wesley decides that he is going to move there, and he is going to become the pastor of this new fledgling community. Unfortunately, it all went downhill pretty fast. There are a number of stories that really provide us evidence that Wesley's world, you might say, is beginning to unravel just a bit. On the boat ride over, actually, and we've noted this in a few places, a trip across the sea in this day and age was really pretty chaotic and hectic. Until the discovery of instrumentation to be able to measure longitude, it would not be too extreme to say that you're essentially sailing blind. You know where you are in terms of latitude based on the horizon and on the sun and other kinds of things, but you have no idea how far you've made it across the Atlantic Ocean, how much more time is left, and it could be, frankly, pretty nerve-wracking. We noted in our lecture on the 18th century that a trip over the Atlantic could take anywhere from 21, 22 days at its best to a whopping 3 months to get all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, depending on currents, depending on the winds. The ships during this time were also not necessarily massive. Well, what happens during the trip is Wesley loses, frankly, some of his nerve. His patience and his trust in God is tested. On the boat with him were a number of people who we will talk about in a minute, known as the Moravians. Their leader at this time was a man by the name of Auguste Spangenberg. Spangenberg is coming to the New World, in part, to find a place for the Moravians to have new land and new opportunities in the new colonies. He actually heads straight for Pennsylvania at some point, where he founds the first Moravian church in America. He also is the man who founds the city of Nazareth in Pennsylvania. Spangenberg, in other words, is vitally important and a very key figure in this Moravian movement. Well, the Moravians, again, coming out of Lutheran Pietism, are significantly passionate and confident, you might say, about their salvation and about their place should God decide to take them home. At one point, there was a storm that erupted, and Wesley, losing his lunch, quaking and shaking and fearful there on the boat, was struck by how peaceful and calm the Moravians were during this ordeal. They were singing the Psalms together, quite patient, realizing that should their life be forfeit, that they rest in Christ. Meanwhile, Wesley, again, is just simply shaking like a leaf. That's a real crack in the armor. Here's a man who, frankly, had probably a good bit of pride. He knew he was about his serious faith, and yet here, when it was actually tested, when he thought his life was up, he was bested by those from the Moravian Church. The second major crisis that Wesley comes across while there in the city of Savannah is his relationship with Sophie Hopke. Wesley arrives to the area of Savannah, and he's mentoring, essentially you might say, as a high churchman. He's big on liturgy, he's big on the Book of Common Prayer. At this point, of course, he is an Anglican pastor, an Anglican priest. He follows the Book of Common Prayer, and he does all kinds of different things, very much, you might say, from the high churchman perspective. Well, as you can imagine, in the colonial period, there were all kinds of folks there in the New World who were not necessarily positive on the state church or the traditional way that things were being run. He seems, in other words, to have chafed relationally with a few people. His relationship with Sophie Hopke, though, is a real microcosm of where Wesley's personality is going. He is attracted to her. He even seems to have a certain amount of love for her. He wants to marry her at some point, but eventually he comes to the conclusion that they are not meant for each other. And then Sophie Hopke, almost with a little bit too much haste, marries someone else there in the community. The issue, though, is that Wesley is also their pastor. And so, in a real foolish move, applying the strict letter of the law from the Anglican service and the liturgy, Wesley, as the pastor, sensing that Sophie's concern for the matters of the faith had grown a bit dim now that she was happily married, meant that he should withhold communion from her. Not just from her, though, but also from her new beau. This is retaliatory, obviously. The next service, he withholds communion from her and from her new husband, and it sets off a chain of events that eventually gets Wesley kicked out of Savannah. He has to flee, and he runs with his tail between his legs back to London. So much so for the missionary going off to do so much good. It's around this time where a real depressed, morose, kind of beat down Wesley, remembers the Moravians who had been on the ship with him heading over to Savannah. And he's back in London, and he actually attends, on one evening, the 24th of May, 1738, a Moravian meeting there in the city of London at a place called Aldersgate. Now, you'll recall from our lecture on Lutheran Pietism that there is this movement towards not works, but towards the emotional life, towards the passionate, true Christianity, as people like Spencer and others began to talk about in Germany a century before. Well, there at Aldersgate, there was read aloud the preface to Luther's Romans commentary. Again, Luther, the great man about the gospel. And Wesley describes this actually as his conversion, and he says, quote, "My heart was strangely warmed." It is some halfway point between a pietistic emotional response and something that Wesley would go on to describe later as a conversion to, he thinks, the actual Christian faith. Now, there's been all kinds of head-scratching about this and fights and debates. The biggest problem of all is, how do you understand a man who has been about the Christian life his entire life, who has been a pastor for years, who has been a missionary to the New World, and who has sought the things of God and rested on salvation, seemingly at least, all these years? How can you describe this in 1738 as his conversion? Well, the answer is in part that Wesley himself describes it as a conversion. The central problem, though, is when Wesley describes what that conversion is, it's very clear he's not talking about justification or a sinner's prayer. He says in a letter that what he has converted to and what he believes conversion is finally the eradication and the conquering of sin in your life. He says sin had warred within him, and because of this conversion, as he calls it in 1738, sin no longer dominated him. Now again, from a Lutheran perspective, from an early Protestant perspective, that sounds suspect. That sounds, you might say, Pelagian leaning, something like this. But where is Wesley coming from? He's coming from this dissenting, Anabaptist, relatively holiness-focused, sanctification-focused perspective. Even though he's been an Anglican all these years, there is certainly almost a DNA within him that is seeking not so much the conversion through the sinner's prayer or through resting alone on the works of Christ, but rather this yearning for conquering sin in his life. Well, in 1738, he has found this. Now, the question is how does Pietism link up with this dissenting movement there in the English context? Well, in part, the answer is that connection happens, you might say, personally in John Wesley's life. What do I mean? Well, I'm often asked to describe what evangelicalism is, because evangelicalism in the modern context and in the historical context is Protestant, but it also has different impulses, and it doesn't at times, you might say, feel quite the same. Well, without being too pejorative or too overly simplistic, when asked what evangelicalism is historically, I often say it's the Protestant understanding of justification, in particular that of Luther, with the Zwinglian understanding of the sacraments. Virtually no evangelical in the context of the Americas, particularly not after Wesley, tends to believe in a pure physical eating of the Eucharist. So they trend Zwinglian. And that combination syncs up with the pietistic movement of the emotional life, of regeneration, small groups, and revivalism. How do all those things come together? Well, in this case, in the person of John Wesley, they come together in his life. Here's a man who was raised by a mother of a dissenting pastor. He had himself been Anglican, and now he has described his conversion with these pietists from the Moravian church. Not only that, but in that same year, Wesley takes a pilgrimage to Hernhutt, where Count von Zinzendorf had founded the Moravian church from the very beginning. Wesley, you might say, will combine a number of different theological and ecclesiological elements within his own self-identity. He will not simply become Moravian. Again, he's going to go on to establish the Methodist denomination. But he will incorporate all kinds of ideas about how German Lutheran pietism should be shaped in the context of holiness. Now, as we'll see, particularly when we look at our next lecture, the shift, the change in the person of Wesley is that Wesley is not Lutheran. He has very little concern, frankly, for Luther's concern about the differentiation between justification and sanctification. If anything, Wesley is ultra committed to the subject of sanctification in a way that would make him fundamentally opposed to the Lutheran faith, that you do not seek sanctification, because to do so would be to justify, or at least appear to be justifying yourself by works. Now, as we'll see in our next lecture, that's unfair to describe Wesley as being non-Lutheran. However, with the coming of John Wesley and with his conversion here, and with his rise eventually to be head of a new Methodist church, you see a new day dawning where the Arminian perspective, as it was known a century before from the Synod of Dort and from the Dutch regions, gets reshaped and remolded to become the Wesleyan holiness and Arminian perspective on the Christian life.